So, is the Nintendo Switch 2 actually a bit of a headache? And yeah, did the dreaded drift from Nintendo Switch 1 really come back? I've been testing it hard since launch, and even though I genuinely love it, I've spotted 10 real issues that can spoil the experience. Stuff Nintendo doesn't exactly advertise, ranging from delicate hardware to bugs that, in the worst case, can wipe your games. The good news, you don't need to box it up and return it. With these 10 simple fixes, you can turn Nintendo Switch 2 into the ultimate setup. Let's begin with the Nintendo Switch 2 screen. It looks amazing, yes, but it's also very sensitive. After technical testing, it has been confirmed that the display has an anti-shatter layer on top, so if the console falls, the glass won't scatter everywhere. The downside is that the scratch resistance is very low. On the Moss hardness scale, Nintendo Switch 2 screen sits at 3 out of 10, which basically means objects like keys, coins, or even the plastic of the Nintendo Switch 2 dock could scratch it. The solution is not removing the protective film, something Nintendo strongly advises against, but instead, the moment you take it out of the box, applying a 9H tempered glass screen protector. That way, it's just much harder to scratch the surface, and if it does get scratched, you can just replace the protector and keep enjoying your games in handheld mode without having to look at those ugly scratches. Slow internet connection on Nintendo Switch is supposed to be over with Switch 2, and yet a lot of users still see that. Even with a blazing fast fiber connection, Switch 2 download and upload speeds crawl along at around 25 megabytes per second, and the culprit might be IPv6 incompatibilities, which are enabled by default on the console and which we recommend disabling as soon as you can. Basically, Switch 2 doesn't play nicely with some modern Wi-Fi 6 routers, which can make it connect to the 2.4 GHz band instead of 5 GHz, or cause speed drops due to bottlenecks. To fix it, go to your network settings, edit the configuration, and disable IPv6. With this simple change, the console will get along much better with your home internet. Ideally, you want a NAT Type A on Nintendo Switch 2 so you don't run into issues playing with other players, but to do that, you'll need to assign a fixed IP to the console and enable DMZ on your router. One of the most serious and most annoying issues in Nintendo Switch, and honestly, in Nintendo's entire history, is back, but with a few key differences on Nintendo Switch 2. Joy-Con Drift, or Joystick Drift, made the analog joysticks register movement even when you weren't touching them, sometimes making it impossible to play games properly on Nintendo Switch. This problem was caused by dirt getting into the joystick mechanism and wear on the graphite potentiometers. On Nintendo Switch 2, the joystick technology is exactly the same as on Switch 1, so Joy-Con Drift is still possible on Nintendo Switch 2 due to physical wear over time. That being said, a huge part of Switch 1's cases came from dirt, and Switch 2's Joy-Con have a fabric cover around the joystick that does a much better job protecting those potentiometers. In short, they can still fail from wear, but they're better shielded than Nintendo Switch 1's Joy-Con against dust and grime. Of course, if your console is under warranty, Nintendo will repair your Switch 2 controllers for free if they're affected by this problem. And if it's out of warranty, you can always replace the joysticks yourself and install Hall Effect sticks, which are resistant to Joy-Con Drift, although the rest of the console's buttons have another issue. Some players have had major issues with Nintendo Switch 2's image quality on TV, and the main culprit is HDR. If your TV's RGB range doesn't match the console's, the image can look washed out. Flat contrast, dull saturation, and blacks that turn into a grayish mess. Most TVs support full RGB range, but the console is set to auto by default, and this option is notorious for getting it wrong. The fix is super simple. Force the RGB range to full if your TV supports it. Do that, tweak your TV's picture settings, and Switch 2 will look absolutely gorgeous with no weirdness. You can also access a more hidden HDR setup screen to set a maximum brightness level. Nintendo recommends going 6 steps above the lowest possible value, although this depends a bit on your taste and how bright you want your games to pop. Just don't overdo it, because pushing it too far can make bright colors lose detail in some games. Warning: be careful how you use microSD express cards on Nintendo Switch 2. There's a common console issue that affects data stored on memory cards and can corrupt them more easily than you'd expect. MicroSD express cards can move huge amounts of data at insane speeds, but they're also more prone to problems. If you're downloading a game and, at the same time, you're browsing the Nintendo eShop hunting for more game deals, the console can freeze and corrupt the microSD express data. It seems the issue comes from a resource conflict, having to manage the card's high transfer speeds while the system is doing something else. So please, as much as possible, avoid heavy OS tasks while you're downloading game data. This process is more sensitive than on Switch 1, and you can end up having to re-download all your digital games. And just a reminder, Nintendo Switch 2 is only compatible with microSD express cards. Even though Nintendo Switch 2 supports Bluetooth headphones, you might have noticed the audio is slightly delayed compared to the action on screen. And no, it's not your headphones, and it's not your console either. There's a limitation of the audio codec being used, which introduces around 200 milliseconds of latency, and that can feel a bit distracting during your sessions. Sadly, there are only two ways to solve it, and neither is native. If you want zero latency, you'll need a USB-C adapter that transmits audio over a 2.4 GHz connection, plugging into one of the console's two USB-C ports. Or you can simply use a classic 3.5mm audio jack cable. We know it's not what you wanted to hear, but at least you'll hear it with no delay. After the screen, the most delicate part of Nintendo Switch 2 is the connector that sits exposed on the inside of the Joy-Con 2. It's what connects the controllers to the console and charges them at the same time, so any damage to these connectors can mess up your very precious console. It is also one of the most protected parts of the system because even though it looks like it's out in the open, the way the Joy-Cons insert leaves a bit of play in the movement to protect them. That, however, annoys some players. If you don't want your Joy-Con 2 to wobble while attached, you can add a small piece of electrical tape or felt to the bottom of the Joy-Con slot to increase firmness without harming the electrical connection. Still, and this matters whether you keep them tighter or looser, try to minimize how much the Joy-Con 2 rotate around the console's axis. It doesn't matter if you pull them off with force because they're held on by magnets and you're not going to break a mechanical latch. But don't be too rough by tilting them forward or backward. It's sturdy, sure, but it's not indestructible. Running out of battery while you're playing is annoying, but running out of battery when it still says 20% left is even worse. Some Nintendo Switch 2 units ship with a miscalibrated battery, which makes them shut down suddenly, even though they still say they have 20 to 30% left. But don't worry, this doesn't mean the battery's defective. You just need to do a simple process to fix it. Fully power off the console by holding the power button and choosing power off. Then press and hold volume up and volume down at the same time, and without letting go, press the power button once. Keep holding the volume buttons until the console restarts, and once it does, it will have recalibrated the battery sensor. Then you can restart the console normally, and the problem should be solved. Nintendo Switch 2's Joy-Cons aren't the only controls that can give you trouble. The rest of the buttons are also quite sensitive to dirt, and plenty of users report responsiveness issues when pressing certain buttons, me included. In my case, the problem's with the ZR and ZL triggers. Sometimes they make false contact, which can cause the console to register one press as multiple presses or not register it at all. Once again, it comes down to external particles getting into the mechanism. The best solution is a manual clean, but opening the console means voiding your warranty. So instead, I recommend blasting compressed air from the outside to try and clear it out, or sending it to Nintendo support if it's still under warranty and it's giving you serious problems. Nintendo Switch 2's emergency reset should only be used if there's no other choice. Sometimes the console can fully freeze and won't respond to the power button or to any controllers. Don't panic, your console probably hasn't turned into a brick yet. Software lockups on Nintendo Switch 2 are relatively common, and even if it doesn't respond to anything, you can cut power completely by holding the power button for about 15 seconds. Press down without releasing it. That'll force a hard reset and bring the console back, even if the operating system had a full meltdown. Have you ever run into another Nintendo Switch or Nintendo Switch 2 problem that isn't on this list? Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next videos about the console. Thanks for watching. See you next time.